So there's another great question from the audience, and it gets us back a little bit to the ethics questions. Could an opt-out consent form be used for images for AI purpose? In other words, can we create a consent form where a patient could opt out of having an AI used in their analysis? Or more generally, how do we handle consent for informed consent when AIs are put into all branches of healthcare? You know, whether it's radiology or oncology, if the oncologist is using an assistant. So is this something that needs to be dealt with in consent? And is there a difference between clinical consent and research consent? Thanks.
So I wanted to ask this question since the whole issue of education came up. So I'm going to ask it now because I still think it's extremely germane to this. You cannot have informed consent from someone who does not understand what they're consenting to. So if your patients have not been educated on what an AI is doing for whatever clinical practice you run, whether it's radiology or general medicine, and you're using these AIs for a diagnostic aid or for your image analysis or however you're using them, you can't ask your patients to opt in or out if they don't know what that means or what it means to their care. And equally, if you don't educate them, they will be out there on Google educating themselves to whatever degree, you know, whatever that means, and you're going to get it in your practice. You're going to have that patient bring your radiology report to you and say, well, you didn't do anything about this, or they may even bring their images to you and say, well, they've been out on Google and they matched this using some AI they don't understand, and they think this is really bad. So I think this brings us full circle. We've talked about educating the clinicians, about educating the vendors, about educating the researchers who need to understand what it is they're trying to help the clinicians do, but we also have to be educating our patients.
Okay. So, yeah, could I ask sort of an ethics consult here about how do we handle informed consent in this world?
Okay. I think consent is mandatory because it's the basis of autonomy, and autonomy is the basis of human dignity. The point is, can we use a formal, informed consent with a lot of bureaucracy and lack of education from the people, as it was said, or can we use, according to one of the questions of the audience, this opt-out or the presumed consent? And there is a trend among the ethicists to favor the presumed consent, the opting out. So it means if I trust, if I believe in the value of research, in the progress of knowledge, in this case, I will give a presumed consent. No matter in any time I can change my position and saying to the official or to an office that I don't want that my data are for research purpose. But for this, I think we have to promote a public perception of the value, of the social value of the research. And this way, I think we are promoting an alliance, let me say an healthy alliance between patients and doctors and researchers and institutions and the state. So this public perception of the relevance of the progress of knowledge is utmost relevant. That's my view. There is also a trend among bioethicists to call these scientific citizenship. That's a new concept. Just is to empower individuals for their participation in research. Thank you.
So when a patient comes to a teaching hospital, part of the consent process is an understanding that their experience and their images, their laboratory tests will become material that we use and our students and our residents use for teaching, for learning. So is it that different? You know, it's one thing to say that we're going to use your images to turn that into a product, right? This is sort of like the abuse of Henrietta Lacks, you know, and her cells. But it is, if I have a CT scan done at an institution, that's going to be used to teach residents, to teach medical students. Could it also be used to teach AI systems? Would that be within the role of not thinking of it as commercial development, but to think of it as part of the teaching process?
Yeah, that's a good argument. But the point is that the legislation is quite different from one country to one site.
Mm-hmm.
So you need not permission in China, for instance. And there's a lot of bureaucracy in Portugal, for instance. You know? It's in contrast.
I can have a comment from the audience.
Yeah. Hi, we've been talking about consent and making the presumption that actually from an ethical framework, consent is necessary. But if we look at the GDPR and the way it's actually phrased in law, consent is only one legal basis for the processing of data. And so many institutions, the Institute of Cancer Research where I work in particular, have ruled that the legal basis that they will operate on is precisely not consent, because if you rely on consent under GDPR for all your processing for scientific use, then you have to allow for the fact that patients are allowed at any time to withdraw their consent, and that makes operation of research very difficult. Whereas if you rely on the legal basis of research for the benefit, for societal benefit, then that's a very different landscape under which to do research. So that's one point. And another quick point is to ask about the presumption I think we had it earlier, that the patient owns their own data. Now, I think in many cases in the UK, that would not be accepted by hospital trusts at all. And indeed, there's an enormous amount of research that will be going on patient data within the NHS as a sort of private national healthcare system, as a national healthcare system that patients won't know about at all, precisely in terms of like training residents, training AI algorithms. But this will all occur within the NHS firewall, and it won't involve consent at all, I believe.
Well, there's a nice question from on the Twitter feed that sort of relates to your last point about, well, let's get outside the NIH firewall. How to use imaging AI for patient outreach beyond the hospital and clinic, especially out into resource-limited areas or rural areas. This is coming from a very rural place in the U.S. This is one of our key research foci is how do we reach the very rural areas that are tremendously underserved and have ridiculously high incidences of, say, colorectal cancer for reasons that nobody understands. How do we do research? How do we have a clinical impact out there? And what's the role of AI technology in order to, as a force enabler? So I expanded on the question. It was a great question from the audience, but I sort of grew it a little bit. But
So we know that there has been already very good use made of certain AI algorithms, certain pieces of AI software in third world countries or low-income countries, I suppose I should call them now. For example, let's take the example of Alison Noble's work. Alison Noble, who is a computer scientist, engineer, who Professor Noble works in Oxford. She's not a radiologist, but she has devised with her team really quite excellent software that analyzes the fetus in utero with ultrasound, and in these rural areas in Africa, having that software be able to alert the healthcare system, I won't even say doctors because there are no doctors out there, but the sort of community midwives or whatever, that there is a concern that the fetus is not growing appropriately, or that there might be congenital abnormality, and then that one woman will be transported to a centre where this could be looked into. Now that is, very valuable, and so if you like, our standards or our ethics are going to be different in different parts of the world. So that is so much better than having nothing. And the same could be true in rural areas in India or whatever, to have a chest X-ray which is performed in order to pick up tuberculosis or important communicable diseases or cancer or whatever, to spot an abnormality rather than having no report by any doctor at all, would be considered, and I would subscribe to that, as being of huge benefit to the population. But it may not, that wouldn't necessarily be something that would be appropriate to institute in a London teaching hospital, for example.
True, but I think your example is an excellent one. I've made the point in another context that there's a lot of imaging that can be done with one of these, right, with the right sensor. So you can make this an ultrasound scanner that, with a little bit of training, someone in a rural country or a rural state, backed up by an AI assistant, could perform a lot of very useful healthcare.
Professor Noble's done, and I'm arguing that is exactly what should be done and is appropriate.
And by the way, what's on the board is my relationship with Twitter. Yeah, there have been a number of questions on the Twitter feed from a variety of people in the audience having to do with, well, is it premature to be talking about this when we don't have standards really for the data, for, as I talked yesterday, how do I manage annotations or label data? There really aren't standards for communicating that kind of information. So there's so much that's missing in the infrastructure for how do we acquire information, communicate it, and do things with it. So is it premature? Throw Sandy a microphone.
So along with that question, this may not be the exact answer you're looking for, but if I have a CT exam someplace and my doctor tells me what the report said and what I need to do about it, I have a right to take that CT scan and go talk to another doctor about it, right? So how are you going to know if I just go talk to an AI about it? And I come back and I say, here's what your competition says. What do you think? And I don't even tell you whether or not it's an algorithm or another doctor. I mean, we certainly can do that, and I think we may see things like that happening.
This is linked to the fact, in my understanding, that with AI, we are magnifying the hierarchy knowledge, which is linked to authority. So what we need to define is the concept of authority within our departments, within the medical world, and because this will affect the relationship with the patient. I don't know what you think about it from the ethics perspective, how the new code of ethics of AI should deal with this problem of authority.
About authority? Or in Latin, authorities? No, I think, let me move to another point that have not been addressed yet, and I think very interesting. Is the patients provide the data, but the result of research can be commercialized. So can be some confront of positions between the gift-giving perspective of the patients and the intellectual property that results from the outcome of the research. And that's a critical point for the belief of the patients on research and on social value of the research. transparency is needed for that.
So to actually try to answer your question, that second radiologist didn't get a choice in how that exam was protocoled, right? If I get an opinion from a second radiologist, yet I'm allowed to do that, and that radiologist might say, well, if I had scanned this, I would have used a T2 weighted sequence or something like that, but looking at these images, this is what I think. If we can do that with real human doctors, we can do that with AIs as well, even before these standards for how images should be acquired are ever agreed upon.
I'd like to come back to the standardization of images, which has been a very painful process in my own research. So it's close to my heart. And the other thing that I just wanted to link with the standardization of image acquisition protocols is also to do with request coding and nomenclature of scans. So in the UK, we now have a standard set of codes that we request. I don't think that the image protocol, the acquisition protocol, exactly matches the request code still. And that's another step which clearly Aphidia have managed to achieve. But one thing that I was really astounded by was I learned at ECR this year that actually there's no standardized request codes within even some countries in Europe, let alone within Europe itself. And this is a big project that ESR will be taking on, but I think it's going to benefit and actually allow AI to be harnessed if we do have some harmonization. But it's going to require everybody to say yes. So can I just ask, just to get a bit of audience involvement again, this seems to be my theme, how many people here would be comfortable changing the request codes in their own, I know the UK we have to, but those that are not in UK, or even UK, what if ESR said, actually, we're going to have Europe-wide request codes, we're going to change your codes on your RIS system. How many people would say, yep, that's no problem with me, we want to comply as a community? How many people would say, no problem? Do we take a picture, quick? How many people would say that would be a really big problem for us because of our billing and et cetera, or the way we manage our department? So there are a number where it would be a big problem. Do you want to?
I would have expected all the Americans to raise their hand on that second question.
Well, So we face this kind of in two. I can give you two different experiences. One, we have our health system, and a lot of the academic centers in the United States are part of health systems. We have 6 hospitals, some 10 clinics affiliated with us. And it was chaos because you had one place that called it CT-A/P, you had another one that called it Abdo-Pel-CT, and everybody had their own homegrown nomenclature. So we as a group needed to move to some standard nomenclature for procedures. And in fact, the RSNA, through the development of the RADLEX playbook, which is now part of LOINC, so that's an international standard, has created a nomenclature for radiology procedure names. And it was easier for us as a group to say, we're all going to move to this standard, because then it wasn't, well, the central hospital, this is mine, and you're just going to have to give up yours and that. But it also, what powered much of this was a really important use case, and that was a requirement that we report dose for things like CT, dose index, and to do that in a way that my department and Fred's department can both be on the same scale is we have to name our procedures the same way. And in order to do that, we map our procedure names to this national standard.
To be clear, my department's biomedical informatics. We have to clean up the mess that your departments didn't actually do in the mapping.
But that's our job. So, this is the challenge that allows all of us to move forward with these things. But yeah, it's and getting us to a point of standardization. It is painful. It's painful to craft the codes. It's painful to move to them. But then downstream, the advantage is we're all speaking the same language. And when you do something and I do something, we can actually recognize that we're speaking the same language, and we have unified concepts. So it's tremendously powerful.
Yeah, and that is exactly the right point. And there seems to be an energy barrier someplace, because we can all agree that we need to have standard protocols, standard coding schemes. Then it makes sense. We can do research with the data. We can do process improvement, but it doesn't happen. And several people commented about the App Store approach to being able to plug and play modules from different vendors. DICOM created at least a proposal for a standard in that area. There's FHIR, in the HL7 world. A number of vendors have actually implemented such things, and it's gone zero. Just doesn't exist. So there's an energy barrier here, and I'm not sure where it is and why it is, to getting to these standards that we can all see the value of.
So again, having the carrot in this, the advantage is that we all sing on the same song, but there has to be something that gets people over that activation energy. So for us in the United States, a large part of it was this dose index registry, which provided a use case. For us, as a health system, we wanted to move everyone onto the same platform, so we had to have some standard, some unified way of naming our exams. So there has to be something. The remarkable story, I'll just give you one, is the College of American Pathologists now use these electronic cancer checklists. It's a standardized way of reporting pathology information. And the pathologists thought, yeah, it's a great idea, but I don't want to do it. And they resisted. And one of their members actually went to the American College of Surgeons, who certify cancer centers. And the American College of Surgeons made it a requirement of cancer centers that they used electronic cancer checklists, so the pathologist had to do it as a result. And you can imagine the grumbling and this concern. I will tell you that the person who proposed this and who used as a lever, used the surgeons to make her own specialty take on this behavior, later won the gold medal from the College of American Pathologists. And, but you can imagine there was some pain along the way to get there.
Managing change.
Yeah.
Change management is really such an issue. I saw one question here, which was, have you got another question?
Well, I think Nicola's arm's going to break if we don't give her a microphone shortly.
No, I just wanted to come back on that standards thing because, we have seen this before, as you said, Fred. Before we had DICOM, there was ACR, NEMA, and so forth, and there was a vested interest by all the vendors not to comply with any standards so that they could have buy-in to their particular system and lock in institutions into their particular system. So it's not something that is new or that we haven't met before. So there has to be some kind of a win-win or some kind of an incentive for such standards to be adopted. And one of the incentives that we are seeing, and it can be slow, and certainly in DICOM, the buyers started to say, well, is your PACS DICOM compliant? Is it using any private attributes that's going to cause me problems when I send my images to the other hospitals in my region or whatever? And so in terms of, for example, adopting the IHE TCE profile that I mentioned in my talk, this is hugely slow, and this is a big barrier for us, certainly at the Royal College of Radiologists, where we're trying to build up a large archive and examination for exams, in fact, for our exam. We want an anonymized teaching archive. And what we want is for radiologists around the country to be able to submit by a click of a button at their PACS an imaging study, which is anonymized as it goes through their firewall and can go into an archive. And those are the same sorts of requirements that we may have for building up an archive of AI studies or whatever. And the way around that is to get the trust. Okay, it's easier for us, I suppose, in the National Health Service, but to put out, and the Royal College has put out, guidance on PACS tenders, for example. So when PACSs are renewed in a hospital, our guidance says, make sure that in your tender document, in your request for interest or whatever, that your specification states that your PACS has to have implemented the IHE TCE requirement. And so that once that starts going into the tender specifications, then companies, if they're going to be considered for that institution, will sign up to it. So we have to find some means whereby, this gets into, as, we heard the example of the pathologists or whatever, and they haven't even adopted DICOM properly for their images, unfortunately, which is why they're behind in terms of AI algorithms and software. So we have to find a means whereby it's, if you like, mandated, or it becomes a win-win situation.
Well, that's a great point. And DICOM was adopted largely because the RSNA said, we're going to have connect-a-thons. We're going to hold the vendors' feet to the fire and say, you're going to show up and demonstrate you can do this. And after a couple of decades of doing that, it sort of worked. And both governments in the U.S., it was largely the Defense Department, said, as you just said, here is our standard acquisition document, and it has this language in it, and it will comply with these standards, and it will do these things. That caused vendors to, I think someone said it earlier today, somebody's going to have to pay for this, and until there's money that's, that there's value that's recognized and there's a mechanism for making money from it, it's not going to happen. And so I think this is one of the ways in which we drive the standardization, is by having societies sort of force it, or governments, and that causes a change to happen.
But you could imagine a kind of a connect-a-thon for AI algorithms, so that, if you took your archive, for example, then, you could say, well, it works on all these images, and then others could try and see if it works for theirs.
Well,
And
but
they could
what's
say, well,
interesting is we have challenge competitions, which are exactly that, but they're not focused on standardization of how the results are represented or how the data is represented. It's just whose algorithm is better. That's nice, but I think we need...
But you could develop it such that, look,
Exactly.
the input data is such rubbish in terms of its lack of standardization that no wonder you can't use this fabulous algorithm.
I have one more here. So.
I agree with you. I don't know if it's working. Yes, no. I agree with you that somebody will have to pay for it, but putting my administrator hat on this time, somebody will need to be reimbursed for it.
Yes.
We have not talked about at all about what it would take to do that. An FDA approval does not equal reimbursement. And you need to convince, at least in the US, the CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the third-party payers. And I think going back to the level of validation, I think I totally agree standardization is important. But validation is even more important, using evidence-based medicine. I think we shouldn't underestimate that problem.
Okay. Well, actually, I can see two here. One is you need a license to practice medicine or drive a car. Should access to radiology AI be limited to those with a license to use them? And you could couple that with the next question, which is, should there be a sub-specialization in radiology for AI and machine learning? Should we license, should there be a special training involved? Should there be special licensing for using this technology in radiology? Or any other branch of medicine for that matter?
What do you think, Moo? That was your We want your opinion. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what my opinion is. Like I said earlier, I do think that it would be hugely advantageous for... There was another question about authorship of papers. And for radiologists always being missed out on authorship of on papers, another painful thing for us radiologists. I think if we want to be part of this AI explosion and revolution, there have to be some members of our community who are real experts in this field. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to be expert in the field and understand. But if we want to be part of this big explosion and change in healthcare, we need a group of our young trainees doing PhDs in convergent science where they've got radiology, radiomics, machine learning. We need a group of people that are really deeply involved in this, and they will have the license. But I don't think all of us will to use the AI tools, but I think there needs to be a branch perhaps, like I guess it's part of informatics really. Perhaps it's an established expertise in radiology, which is the radiology informatics, where we can have experts in that can be contributing to authorship papers, the academic side, merging with and working with industry. So that's my opinion.
Sorry,
We have all the microphones done, yes.
Brad, sorry, can I just
It's
I asked the question from the point of view that, you know, I'm just slightly concerned that, you know, if we make this publicly available, is that then you have everybody trying to feed their images into a so-called algorithm and see what it comes out with, and then start challenging people with the experience and the knowledge that we've trained for years to acquire and provide that level of expertise. So I was just thinking that, you know, perhaps at least at the start, it might be meaningful to restrict the use of these to people who are already doing this sort of work, rather than opening it up to, say, the public, who could quite, you know, easily, if available, load their chest X-ray up and say, look, you missed this lung nodule, and make wow be that they missed it. But do you want to open a profession out to this sort of challenge that neither do we want, or well, it might in the long term be a good thing, but at least before we know how well the technology works and how sort of additional social implication it may have, that we should restrict that. That's my point of view.
It's a really, you know, it's sort of, it's like the saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. In this case, a little intelligence is a dangerous thing, yeah? I'm dangerous because I have very little intelligence and very little knowledge. I think the challenge will be, considering that there's been sort of a trend towards, shall I say, democratization, you know, there's sort of this universal access, you know, that we all now consult Dr. Google. You know, everyone lives with Radiopedia and various other resources. It would be, I think it'd be very challenging, you know, in the sense that if someone puts their AI chest reader up there where all you have to do is upload an image in DICOM or JPEG, right, and it gives you the diagnosis of that image, it's going to be very challenging for people to stop individuals from going that route, I would think.
I think we need to read that top Twitter feed very carefully.
Okay, it's time for football. Much more important. Actually, I wanted to comment on Moo's point before we'll pass out. I want to give you a little history. So once upon a time, we were faced at a previous institution I worked in with radiologists who refused to do resist measurements for clinical trials. And we had 200 clinical trials going on that needed resist measurements. So we set up a separate workflow where technologists were trained with really good software to do this. And they did a very good job of longitudinally measuring response to therapy. And then someone said, well, this data really needs to go into the EHR. And my question was, do you really want to do that? Yes, we have to put this in the EHR. You realize that the radiologists are not going to like this because you're going to disagree. No, we have to put this in the EHR. They've spent several years with fistfights over who had the right answer, this separate pipeline or the radiologist who had said no progression, and the pipeline said no, definite progression. So it's the same problem as the AI example that you've been doing, except that you can do it right now without the AI. And it's when we set radiologists up for these disagreements that you know, they can be handled, but when they're handled privately and you resolve it as amended reports, it's one thing. But when it's public, then it becomes a very different issue. And so it seems like you would want to avoid that situation, but maybe not.
I don't think we're going to be able to avoid that situation. I don't think we're going to be able to avoid it, and I think we're going to have to learn how to manage that situation.
I think we have a comment from the audience.
Yes, there's a very serious legal implication here. I've read a number of tweets this morning and yesterday that a lot of people are concerned that a radiologist is reading a report from a screen and made a report from what they've seen on their platform, yet there is an AI conclusion saying, well, there's a 27% possibility of a tumor, and you have a conflict between the radiologist and the AI system. One thing is clear is, what is the expectation of a radiologist today? Because if a patient should take their scan and go to Dr. Google and find a different result, who is responsible and who is liable? The current expectation in the United Kingdom is based on 2 cases. One was reported in 1957, and one was referred to in 1979. And there have been a number of cases about having a logical reasoning when a doctor comes to a conclusion. From a legal perspective, there is a fundamental question here. What is the expectation of a radiologist? And is it respected conclusion by a respectable, responsible body of medical opinion? Now, it's that respectable, responsible body of medical opinion saying, yes, that radiologist has looked at that scan and come to this conclusion. However, it doesn't distract that if a faculty or a healthcare unit adheres to what we called old systems and not advancing in new systems, could they be clinically negligent? Because if there is somebody out there in Belgium or France who says this 27% potential of cancer should have been disclosed to that patient to get a further review, it could be argued that faculty is not learning and developing its knowledge of scanning what would be expected of a respectful body of medical opinion. Because if you look across all these countries, there are different skill sets and different skill levels. Because we've got automation of our phones, the world has become a very small place. And so that patient could say, well, why did you not disclose that report to me? Because I may have taken a second or third opinion. Or if you weren't using AI, why weren't you using AI? Or if you were using AI, why wasn't it disclosed to me? So law is in its infancy, medicine is progressing, but the responsibility still lies upon the clinician.
Yes.
So I think there are a couple of points to be made there. I think we have to recognize that actually, in terms of apps, for example, this is already the case. If you take general practice, it's routine pretty much for patients to walk into general practices in the UK and say to their doctor, well, look, I actually think that I've got cancer of the pancreas or whatever they might have found on Google, because I've noticed my urine's a bit dark recently, my stools are a bit light, and hey, you did those liver function tests the other day and my bilirubin is raised. And it's then up to the GP to justify that and say, well, yes, but look, it's the only liver function test that's abnormal. I think you've got Gilbert syndrome. You don't have to worry about it. We've had a look at the stool samples or whatever, and they're all fine. And maybe he does need to have an ultrasound of the pancreas or a CT or whatever, but that GP has to justify his diagnosis based on the test results. And you can't stop patients from looking at apps that are already out there in the same way that once we get AI readily available, I don't think you can stop. And why should you stop? Why are we so frightened, actually, of patients having that knowledge and challenging us? I mean, we're challenged in multidisciplinary team meetings. Why do you think that patient has actually got carcinoma of the lung and not old TB or whatever? And we do this all the time. And of course, we'll be wrong sometimes, but we justify our results. And as radiologists, we need to interact more with patients. We need to step up to the plate and be clinical doctors and talk to patients. So there was a study done at the Mass General, which I'm sure many of you read a couple of years ago, where they looked at, there was a trial where radiologists actually came to see the oncology patients in the clinic after the oncologist had seen them and explained their imaging to them. And there was a huge satisfaction positive score in those patients because they actually got something out of having their images interpreted and explained to them by the radiologist. And very often it's a case of, yes, you've got a stage 1 lung cancer or whatever, but you've got such severe emphysema that actually we can't operate on you or whatever. So we are clinical doctors and we've got to recognize that, and trying to hide the information away, I think is daft. I think it's, hiding to nothing. It's already out there in the general practice space, if you like, with all the apps. And we have to recognize that it will be out there in the radiological space, but that's why regulation, proper regulation, is so good. And I think the question earlier in the audience was about when it came up for consent. My understanding of that question was, should patients say, I don't want AI used on the interpretation of my images, in the same way they might say, I don't want my images stored on PACS? But in a way, that's not actually an option, in that they have chosen to use the healthcare system, and doctors are going to use whatever is best practice at the time. And they may be wrong. They may, have said, we are going to do an EVAR procedure on your aortic aneurysm, because 2 years ago that was thought to be the best procedure. Now the pendulum's swinging the other way, and there is a lot of evidence that actually aortic graft replacement has fewer long-term complications. We do the best based on the evidence we have at the time for our patients, and I don't think we should be actually frightened of justifying what we're doing.
Okay. I think we're being told that we're out of time, so I want to thank the panelists for sitting up here and fielding questions, and really thank the audience for a lot of great questions, both on Twitter as well as just grabbing a microphone. So thanks to everyone. And I think we'll turn it back to Moon.
Thank you. So I've been nominated to close the meeting we've had. Actually, it's not the close. As those people who have signed up for the hands-on radiomics workshop this afternoon, you have received hopefully details as to where to go. It's the lunch break now, and it's been for me a tremendous 1.5 days. I've been delighted at the turnout from all the faculty members and their really exciting and insightful contribution to the meeting. We have been in some sort of discussion, Celso and I discussed it. I just wanted to, we of course we would love to receive your detailed feedback on the internet. You have to complete the CME form online. You could have tried to receive credits. But just by way of a show of hand, perhaps, that if we were to advance this course next year with a different sort of content, or perhaps extension of this year's content, would anybody be interested in coming back? Just by show of hand. That's not a bad result, I guess. So without further delay, because there's this football match going on this evening, and some of you might want to travel to the center just to see the city as well. I'd just like to thank everybody involved, the organizing committee, all the faculty members, and of course to Teresa from the Champalimaud Foundation, and Louise Musto from the ICIS central office, that we wouldn't have been able to run this meeting without them. So thank you very much for coming, and please do join us for lunch.